Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 172 and it's titled Ping Pong. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week our random card is going to be a very hotly contested commander. In fact, I'm pretty sure if you look at the EDH rec pages, it is the most popular Is It commander, and that is Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph. So Ghyrson Starn is 1 blue-red for a 3/2 legendary creature Tyrannid human. It has Ward 2, and it has 3 auto stubs. So whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to a permanent or player, Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph deals 2 damage to that permanent or player. So in other words, if we cast a spell and it deals 1 damage to an opponent, Ghyrson will then also do another 2 damage to that opponent, essentially giving us the ability to turn 1 damage into 3. So this probably goes without saying, but since Ghyrson Starn is a legendary creature, that means that our commander for the week is also Ghyrson, kind of an unspoken rule on the channel that if we get a legendary creature as our random card, we do have to build around it. So without going any further into that, let's take a look at some of the themes for our deck and figure out what exactly we want to be doing. So the first theme is kind of where the title of the deck comes from. We have pingers. Our main goal here is to try to focus our pinging abilities on cards that hit each opponent, but not us, meaning we can get the maximum value out of all of our pings. And so to that example, we have Firebrand Archer, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 human archer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. So with Ghyrson in play, we cast a non-creature spell. Firebrand Archer will deal 1 damage to each opponent. Ghyrson will then do 2 damage to each opponent, essentially meaning we just dealt 9 damage, provided we're in a 4-player game, just by casting a single non-creature spell. That is incredibly efficient, it's quick, and it's going to mean that we are a very aggressive deck at the table, doing a ton of damage to our opponents. Now, our next theme is going to give us ways to kind of build upon that pressure by giving us ways to benefit from dealing damage. And it's very important that we focus this on cards that just say or care about whenever we deal damage, not whenever we deal combat damage, because Ghyrson is very rarely going to actually be attacking. So for example, we have Curiosity, which is 1 blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So if we go back to the Firebrand Archer example, we cast a non-creature spell. Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. Then Ghyrson Starn, which is most likely enchanted with Curiosity, will do 2 damage to each opponent. That means that Ghyrson has dealt damage to an opponent 3 times, letting us draw 3 cards. So you can kind of see how that gets out of hand very, very quickly. And like I said, we want to focus on the non-combat damage because Ghyrson's not going to be attacking. But if we can load him up with effects like this, we can really outvalue the rest of the table. And then finally, our last theme that I want to highlight is going to be giving Ghyrson lifelink. This is a little bit trickier than you might expect, given the fact that we are an Is It deck. There's not a ton of ways to give lifelink, but giving Ghyrson lifelink is one of the best and most efficient ways to make sure that we survive into the late game, because if Ghyrson is able to gain us life every time he deals damage, and again, we go back to that example from earlier with Firebrand Archer doing 1 to each opponent, Ghyrson does 2 to each opponent, Ghyrson alone just did 6 damage, and that is damage being dealt by Ghyrson alone, so that means we are gaining 6 life. And so there's not that many cards that give lifelink, like I mentioned earlier, but one of the better ones is Resurrection Orb, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has lifelink, and whenever equipped creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and it equips for 4. So not only is this a great way to make sure that we have lifelink for Ghyrson, but it's also a way to protect him in case somebody's able to wipe the board or remove him in particular, even though he does have Ward 2. So it's probably one of the best lifelink effects in the deck. However, as we move on to our key cards, since we're done with our themes, you'll notice that it's not the lifelink card that's in our key cards section, because that is actually going to go to Basilisk Collar. And Basilisk Collar is 1 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has Death Touch and lifelink, and equip for 2. So you might be wondering why this is so much better than the Orb of Resurrection, and the simple answer is that it also gives Death Touch. If we can just hit all of our opponent's creatures for 1 damage, then Ghyrson is going to hit them all for 2 damage, and yeah, 3 damage is going to kill quite a few creatures in play, but if Ghyrson has Death Touch, we are guaranteeing that every single creature in play dies. And that is incredibly powerful when the vast majority of our pinging effects only hit our opponent's things. I went very deep in this deck trying to make sure that we didn't have much that hit us, because it is very important to remember that Ghyrson will hit us for 2 damage if we deal 1 damage to ourselves or our creatures, so you do really want to try to avoid that. Now, moving on from Basilisk Collar, though, to our next key card. This one is going to be End the Festivities. So in a similar vein to what I was just talking about, doing 1 damage to each creature and each opponent, we have End the Festivities for a single red mana. It's of course a sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker that they control. So End the Festivities is by far the most efficient mass ping effect that we have, because for just 1 mana, if we have Ghyrson in play, we are doing 3 damage to each of our opponents, each of their creatures, and each planeswalker they control. So if, for example, we have Basilisk Collar equipped to Ghyrson, we are gaining 2 life for every opponent, every creature they control, every planeswalker they control, and we have Death Touch, so we're killing every creature they control, and then at that point we can probably still just attack the few planeswalkers if they're still alive, and we've done a massive amount of damage to our opponents. So this is the kind of deck that really focuses on these small effects and just gets them really out of hand. So that is something you want to be aware of while you're playing this deck. It really feels like you are taking control of the game, even though it's not technically a control deck. Now, moving into our last key card, this one is going to be Zerzoth Chaos Rider. And if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll realize that Zerzoth is one of my absolute all-time favorite cards in all of Magic. I have my own personal Zerzoth deck. I've done one for the channel. I pretty much put it in any deck that I can, that I feel like it fits the theme. And for this one in particular, he is incredibly powerful. So, Zerzoth himself is 2 and a red for a legendary creature devil. He's a 2/3. Whenever an opponent draws their first card each turn, if it's not their turn, you create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target, and whenever 1 or more devils you control attack 1 or more players, you and those players each draw a card, then discard a card at random. Now, essentially, what this is going to be doing is creating us an army of devil tokens that they will be attacking as 1/1s, which means that Ghyrson will actually do 2 damage to anything they deal damage to, and if anyone ever blocks them, they still get to do 1 damage to any target, meaning we could put ourselves in a situation where we attack somebody who is at, say, 3 life with a devil token. They know that if they don't block it, they take 1 and then 2 from Ghyrson, so they're dead, or we can have them block it, they kill the devil, then the devil does 1 damage to them, and then Ghyrson does 2, and they still die anyway. So it really puts our opponents in a lot of tricky situations, and it's also a good source of, not necessarily card advantage, because you're drawing and then discarding a card at random, but it's a little bit of hand disruption, because we don't care too much about the cards in our hand. Obviously, there are certain ones that we want, but we know when and where we can discard and when and where we can cast things to take the most advantage of Zerzoth, but our opponents aren't going to be able to make those same decisions. So with all of that being said, we'll move on from Zerzoth because I could keep talking about him for quite some time. But those are all of our key cards. So the next thing that we want to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well with each other, and in some cases are win conditions, in other cases are just value pieces, but either way, I wanted to make sure that they get a little bit of a highlight. So the first cool interaction that we're going to talk about is between Sigil of Sleep and Thermo Alchemist. So Sigil of Sleep is another one of the enchantments that we want to put on a creature that just wants to deal some damage. So, for example, it is 1 blue for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to a player, return target creature that player controls to its owner's hand. So if we can put that onto a creature, like, say, Thermo Alchemist, which is 1 in a red for a human shaman, it's a 0/3 with defender, and it taps to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Thermo Alchemist. So you can kind of get the sense for what's happening here. If we put Sigil of Sleep on Thermo Alchemist and then tap Thermo Alchemist, we are doing 1 damage to each opponent. That means that we are now returning a creature that each opponent controls to their owner's hand. Now, it does target, so we can't get around Hexproof, we'd have to pay for Ward, we can't get around Shroud. But if we cast an instant or sorcery, we untap Thermo Alchemist, we tap it again, we hit everybody for 2, maybe we can even do it a 3rd time, we've just bounced 2 or 3 creatures that each opponent controls to their owner's hand. And if our opponents aren't playing a go-wide strategy, there's a good chance that that really disrupts everything that they're trying to do. Especially because this can happen at instant speed. So if someone tries to, say, combo off, they need a specific creature to do it, we can activate this before the combo, bounce that creature to their hand, we can bounce creatures that are attacking us. It is a great way to control the board state and a great way to slowly burn out the table and watch as there's really nothing that people can do unless they're able to kill the creature that Sigil of Sleep is enchanting. So that is cool interaction number 1. And moving into cool interaction number 2, we have Niv Mizzet Parun and Ophidian Eye. So Niv Mizzet Parun is blue, 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 red, red, red for a 5/5 legendary creature dragon wizard. This spell can't be countered. It's got flying. Whenever you draw a card, Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage to any target, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. So the main goal here is going to be enchanting Niv Mizzet with Ophidian Eye, which is 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura. It's got flash, enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So you can kind of see what's happening here, but if we equip, or I suppose say enchant, it's not an equipment, enchant Niv Mizzet with Ophidian Eye, then every single time Niv Mizzet deals damage to an opponent, we get to draw a card. And whenever we draw a card, Niv Mizzet gets to do 1 damage to an opponent. So that means we can actually draw our entire deck and ping down the rest of the table for all the cards that we have in our library. Now, if all of our opponents are at their full starting life total, 40 life each, that's 120 life. We can't knock everybody out. However, there is a very good chance that people have taken damage throughout the course of the game. There's a good chance we can take out 1, maybe even 2 players. So this is still going to be relevant, and it's even more relevant because Ophidian Eye is a May ability, so we can stop the combo at any time that we want to. We could just draw our entire deck, find some other way to win. But this is a great value piece and honestly pretty much a win condition. I can't imagine that there's too many situations where you lose the game after resolving this, but because of that, that is something you want to be aware of if you're playing in a lower power group or people just aren't a fan of infinite combos. This is technically an infinite combo, even if it may not win the game outright all of the time. So I would at least make sure you're aware of that before sitting down and playing this deck. But with that being said, we're going to move on to the final piece of our deck tech, which is going to be the budget portion of the deck tech. And so this week, out of our $100 budget, the price of the deck came in at $59.19, with the most expensive card being the Commander himself, Ghyrson Starn, at $6.12. Now, this is a really tricky situation because typically I'll explain why you should or should not cut the most expensive card for budget purposes. This deck is not super expensive. $60 is not terrible. However, it's really difficult to suggest cutting not just the card of the week, obviously, but also the commander that we are completely built around. Because I think if you put any other Is It commander into the command zone, the deck still functions, but it's not going to be nearly as efficient. Being able to do 3 damage to an opponent with a single ping instead of just 1 damage is a lot better, and it's definitely going to close out games a lot faster. So that is something to be aware of. Obviously, you could cut Ghyrson if you really needed to, but the deck is just, since it's built around him, it just really would not run as efficiently as you want. So that is my suggestion. Obviously, I would say just keep it the way that it is. But if you're looking for a card to include in the deck that's a little bit out of the price range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So this week, if you're looking for a card to put in, I would recommend slotting in Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Any Warhammer 40k fans, let me know if I said that wrong. But if you're putting in the Flamer, you would also have to take out a card, so I would recommend taking out the Cosmotronic Wave. And so Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch is 2, a blue and a red for a 2/4 demon. It has Sorceress Inspiration, so at the beginning of your upkeep, return an instant or sorcery card at random from your graveyard to your hand. And it has the Fire of Tzeentch. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is one of the pingers that we could be using in the deck. So whenever we cast a spell, we get to do 1 damage to each opponent, but it's also giving us the added benefit that every single turn, we get to return an instant or sorcery. It's at random, but it's still card advantage from our graveyard to our hand. Almost all of our instants and sorceries do damage in some way, meaning that we are able to keep triggering the Exalted Flamer, we're able to keep drawing cards, we're able to keep getting that card advantage, and keep doing damage in ways that the rest of our deck can't really do. They can do it to an extent, but it's very fast, I suppose I should say, when it comes from the Exalted Flamer. So, like I said, if you're putting that card in, I would recommend taking out Cosmotronic Wave, which is 3 and a red for a sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, and creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. This is an effect that we have a couple of cards of in the deck, but it's definitely the most expensive version of what it's trying to do. We have cards that do very similar things just without the blocking text for only 1 mana, so asking to pay 4 is quite the expense. And so that's not to say that it's bad, it's still very good, and there's a lot of ways that you can use this, but the creatures being unable to block this turn actually isn't that relevant for us. We very rarely want to be attacking in this deck because there's not much we can really attack with. All of our creatures are pretty small. A lot of them even have Defender, so that's not that big a deal. So if you're looking for a card to replace it with, which is the exact same mana cost other than the additional blue, Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch is going to be a much bigger improvement over Cosmotronic Wave. Now, with that being said, we of course have to see how this deck functions. We've talked a lot about the pinging, we've talked a lot about the strategy and the value, but we have to see how it actually does in a game. Before we get to that though, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and of course, shout out our current patrons and channel members. So if you're interested, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit, and I really do appreciate it. But if you're looking to support us a little bit more, you can find us on a bunch of social media accounts, including Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, all of which is linked both on screen and in the video description. So before we move on to the deck tech, a quick shout out to all of our patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Richard, Devin Purser, Brian Haney, and Keegan Tawney. So to all of you all, thank you so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's check out our opponents for this week's game. So as always, we are being joined by 3 different opponents this week. The first of which is Doodle playing Ramos Dragon Engine. Then we have Luke playing Ruby Daring Tracker. And we have Richard playing Rin and Seri Inseparable. So starting off with Doodle and his Ramos deck, this is a Charms deck, so the Charming Ramos deck. He wants to play all of the different charms that exist in Magic. So it might be stuff like the Simic charms, and it might be Crosis charms, anything with multiple colors and multiple modes, meaning he's able to get a ton of +1/+1 counters on Ramos very quickly and take advantage of all the cards that say multicolored spells, you do whatever. So very excited to see this deck. I know Charming Ramos is a deck that is very good, so it's one that I'm definitely keeping an eye on in this. Next up, we have Luke and Ruby, and this is a deck that he messaged me about a couple of months ago and is very excited about. It's essentially getting Ruby down for 2 mana, which allows him to, on turn 3, play a 4 mana spell, which is a ton of ramp spells. There's a lot of 4 mana ramp in green, and then that pushes him directly up to 6+ mana, meaning he can, on turn 4, start casting 6 drops as soon as possible. So his deck is full of commons and uncommons that are just massive, beefy creatures that are going to come down relatively early and just keep swinging throughout the course of the game. So it's very much a Timmy-style deck. I know he's very excited for this, and honestly, that is the kind of deck that I started playing when I started playing Magic, so I'm a huge fan of that playstyle, and I'm definitely looking forward to see what he did with it. And then finally, last but not least, we have Richard playing Rin and Seri. And this is exactly what it looks like. This is a dog and cat deck. It is just full of as many dogs and as many cats as he possibly can. He is kind of trying to split the difference, make a ton of dogs, make a ton of cats, and then activate Rin and Seri, get a ton of buffs from all of the lore effects and all of the other stuff that's going on. So Rin and Seri, I think, is probably what I would consider the biggest threat at this table. They've really done a good job recently of improving the dogs and the cats in Magic, so I know that there are a lot of good cards that we need to be aware of, and I know that they synergize very well together. So I think if I had to pick an opponent to be the most concerned about, it is probably going to be Richard. Of course, though, if you think we should be worried about someone else, please do let me know. And in the comments down below, put your prediction. Who do you think is going to win in this game? I'd love to hear what people think. But without any further ado, I say we jump into this game, see how we do, see how our deck holds up. But I hope you all enjoyed it. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Luke, Richard, and then myself. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Path of Ancestry. Luke plays a Forest. Richard plays a Sacred Foundry. I play an Island. Doodle plays a Jungle Shrine, then suspends a Search for Tomorrow with 2 time counters on it. Luke plays a Mountain and casts his commander, Ruby Daring Tracker, attacking me with her for 1 since she also has haste. Richard plays a Wooded Foothills, sacrificing it and paying a life to search his library for a Temple Garden, putting it into play tapped. I play a Mountain. In Doodle's upkeep, he removes a time counter from Search for Tomorrow, then plays a Mountain and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Luke plays a Forest and casts Ranger's Path, searching his library for 2 forests, specifically a basic and a Highland Forest, putting them into play tapped. Richard casts Loyal Warhound, searching his library for a Plains and putting it into play tapped since an opponent controls more lands than he does. Then he plays a Path of Ancestry and passes. I play an Island and cast my commander Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph, which does 2 damage to any target that is dealt exactly 1 damage by a spell or permanent I control. In Doodle's upkeep, he removes the last counter from Search for Tomorrow, casting it and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play. He then plays an island and casts Hero of Precinct 1, letting him make a 1/1 human token when he casts a multicolored spell. Luke plays a mountain and casts Baloth Woodcrasher, which gets +4/+4 and trample when he plays a land. Richard plays a forest and casts his commander Ren and Seri Inseparable. This lets him make a 1/1 cat token whenever he casts a dog, and make a 1/1 dog token whenever he casts a cat. Then he also casts a Selfless Savior, which can sacrifice itself to make another creature indestructible until the end of turn, making a cat token. In response, Doodle cast Orzhov Charm, making a human token, and destroying Rin and Seri, losing 4 life since it had 4 toughness. On my turn, I cast a Tunneling Geopede, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever a land enters under my control. Then I play an island, triggering the Geopede, doing 1 damage to each opponent, which then triggers Ghyrson, doing an additional 2 damage to each opponent. In response, Doodle cast Izzet Charm, making another human token, and doing 2 damage to the Geopede, killing it. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Trace of Abundance, enchanting a land, so that it has Shroud and taps for an additional mana of any color. Since it's also multicolored, he makes another human token, then casts his commander Ramos Dragon Engine, which gets a +1/+1 counter for each color in each spell that Doodle casts, and lets him remove 5 counters to make 2 mana of each color. Luke plays a forest, giving the Baloth +4/+4 and casts Thunderbrute with no opponents paying tribute, so it enters with haste. This means that he's able to attack me for 5 with the Brute, and Doodle for 8 with the Baloth. On Richard's turn, he cast a Felidar Retreat, either making a 2/2 cat token or putting a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures, also giving them vigilance until the end of turn whenever he plays a land, which he immediately does, playing a Sungrass Prairie and making a cat token. I play a mountain and cast Sigil of Sleep, enchanting Ghyrson, so whenever he deals damage to an opponent, I return a creature they control to their hand. Once that resolves, I cast Caltrops, doing 1 damage to a creature whenever it attacks. Finally, I cast Tectonic Hazard, doing 1 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. Thanks to Ghyrson, this winds up doing 3 damage to each creature and opponent, wiping away most creatures on the board and letting me return Ramos, Lightning Brute, and a 2/2 cat token to their owner's hands. Before all of that can happen though, Richard responds by casting Boros Charm, giving all his permanents indestructible until the end of turn and saving his board. On Doodle's turn, he casts Double Vision, letting him copy the first instant or sorcery he casts each turn. Luke plays a forest, giving the Woodcrasher +4/+4 and casts Maelstrom Colossus, cascading into Greater Tanuki. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 8 with the Baloth Woodcrasher. On Richard's turn, he recasts his commander Rin and Seri. I play a Frostboil Snarl, revealing an island so it comes into play untapped, and cast Niv Mizzet Parun, drawing a card whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, and doing 1 damage to any target whenever I draw a card. At the end of turn, Doodle casts Rith's Charm, copying it and making 6 total 1/1 Saproling tokens. This also triggers Niv Mizzet, so I draw a card and do 1 damage to Selfless Savior, but Richard sacrifices it in response, giving Rin and Seri indestructible. On Doodle's turn, he casts Rampant Growth, copying it and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. This also triggers Niv Mizzet, letting me draw a card and do 1 damage to a Saproling, killing it. After that, Doodle casts All Sun's Dawn, returning Cultivate, Rith's Charm, Hero of Precinct 1, Orzhov Charm, and Izzet Charm to his hand. Then I also get to draw a card and do 3 damage to Doodle and return a Saproling to his hand. On Luke's turn, he plays a forest, giving the Woodcrasher +4/+4, and recasts Thunderbrute, this time entering with 3 +1/+1 counters since Richard pays tribute. He attacks Doodle for 8, me for 6, and Richard for 7. Doodle blocks with his 4 Saprolings, killing them and still taking 4, I take 6, and Richard blocks with a cat, killing it and taking no damage. On Richard's turn, he casts Soul's Majesty, drawing 4 cards since he controls a creature with 4 power, and I also get to draw a card and do 3 damage to Luke, once again returning Thunderbrute to his hand. Richard then plays a Plains, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures, and casts Farseek, searching his library for Jetmir's Garden, putting it into play tapped and making a cat token, while I draw a card, do 3 damage to Luke, and return Maelstrom Colossus to his hand. After that, Richard moves to combat and attacks Doodle for 5 with Rin and Seri. When I draw for turn, I do 3 damage to Richard, returning his cat token to his hand. Then I play a mountain and cast Midnight Clock, getting an hour counter in each upkeep and exiling it, shuffling my hand and graveyard into my library, and drawing 7 new cards when it hits 12 counters. After that, I cast a Voldaren Epicure, making a blood, doing 3 damage to each opponent, and returning Greater Tanuki and Rin and Seri to their owner's hands. After that, I cast Nettle Drone, which can tap to do 1 damage to each opponent, and finally, I move to combat and attack Richard for 5 with Niv Mizzet. On Doodle's turn, he cast Rith's Charm, copying it to destroy 2 non-basic lands, destroying Richard's Jetmir Garden and Path of Ancestry. This also lets me draw a card, do 3 damage to Luke, and return the Woodcrasher to his hand. Then Doodle cast Orzhov Charm, destroying Ghyrson Starn, paying 2 for Ward and losing 2 life. Before he's destroyed though, I do still get to draw a card and do 3 damage to Richard, returning Loyal Warhound to his hand. Finally, Doodle cast Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. This lets me draw another card and do 1 damage to Richard. On Luke's turn, he recast Maelstrom Colossus, cascading into Savage Ventmaw. Richard plays a Spire Garden, making a cat token, and recasts his commander Rin and Seri, then recast Loyal Warhound, searching his library for a Plains and putting it into play tapped, while also making another cat token, and putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. At the end of turn, Doodle cast Izzet Charm, copying it to do 2 damage to my Voldaren Epicure and Nettle Drone, killing them both. In response, I sacrifice my blood token to discard a card and draw a card, doing 1 damage to Doodle, then I also draw a card with Niv Mizzet, doing another damage to Doodle. When I draw for my turn, I do 1 damage to Richard, then play an island and recast my commander Ghyrson Starn. I also cast Unruly Catapult, which can tap to do a damage to each opponent, and untaps whenever I cast an instant or sorcery. Doodle plays a Swamp and casts Solve the Equation, searching his library for an instant or sorcery spell. On cast, though, I draw a card with Niv Mizzet and do 3 damage to Doodle with Niv and Ghyrson, knocking him out of the game. On Luke's turn, he recasts Thunderbrute. This time, though, I pay the tribute, putting 3 +1/+1 counters on it. He moves to combat, attacking me for 7 and Richard for 4, making 3 red and 3 green mana when the Ventmaw attacks. In his second main phase, Luke recasts the Baloth Woodcrasher, and finally channels Greater Tanuki, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Richard cast a King of the Pride, making a dog token and giving his other cats +2/+1. Then he cast Shamanic Revelation, drawing a card for each creature he controls, which is 6, and gaining 4 life for each creature he controls, with power 4 or greater, which is 4, so he gains 16. This also triggers Niv Mizzet, letting me draw a card and do 3 damage to Luke. Richard then plays a Mana Confluence, putting a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures, and attacks me for 19 with 2 cats and Rin and Seri. I block Rin and Seri with Niv Mizzet, killing them both and taking 11 damage, going to only 2 life. On my turn, I cast a Butcher's Cleaver, immediately equipping it to Ghyrson Starn, giving him +3/+0 and lifelink since he's a human. I then tap Unruly Catapult, doing 1 damage to each opponent, and this also does 2 damage to each opponent with Ghyrson, and since he has lifelink, I also gain 4 life. Then I cast End of the Festivities, untapping the catapult and doing 1 damage to each opponent and each creature they control, which turns into 3 with Ghyrson, while I gain 22 total life. Then I tap the catapult again, doing 3 more damage to each opponent while I gain 4, and finally I cast Blazing Volley, doing another 3 damage to each creature my opponents control, wiping away everything but the Colossus and the Brute, while I gain another 8 life. On Luke's turn, he casts and kicks a Vastwood Surge, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature he controls. He attacks me with both of his creatures for 19, and they take 3 damage from the Caltrops and Ghyrson, so I gain 4 life. Richard cast a Feline Sovereign, giving his other cats +1/+1, and destroying an artifact or enchantment a player controls when one or more cats he controls deals combat damage to that player. He also cast Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 to play tapped and the other into his hand, making a cat token. He then plays a Kessig Wolf Run and puts another counter on all of his creatures. On my turn, I play a Mountain and tap the Catapult, doing 3 more damage to each opponent, gaining 4 life. Then I cast Fact or Fiction, untapping the Catapult and revealing the top 5 cards of my library, letting Richard separate them into 2 piles. Then I choose to put Izzet Signet into my hand, and Command Tower, Sulphur Falls, Izzet Boilerworks, and a Mountain into my graveyard. In Luke's upkeep, my Midnight Clock gets its 12th counter, exiling itself, shuffling my hand and graveyard into my library, then letting me draw 7 cards. Luke then attacks me for 19 with both of his creatures, while I gain another 4 thanks to the Caltrops. In his second main phase, Luke casts Deathless Behemoth, and at the end of turn, Richard casts Your Temple is under attack, letting himself and Luke both draw 2 cards. In response, I tap the Unruly Catapult, doing 3 damage to each opponent and gaining 4 life. Then I cast Negate, countering the card draw spell, untapping the Catapult, letting me tap it again to do 3 more damage to each opponent, gaining 4 more life, and knocking Luke out of the game. Richard casts Kutzil Malamet Explorer, preventing his opponents from casting spells on his turn, and whenever 1 or more creatures he controls with power greater than its base power deals combat damage to a player, Richard draws a card. He then plays a Mountain, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures, and attacks me for 9 with his 2 cats that are able to attack, both of them taking 3 damage while I gain 4. Then I take the 9 damage, so Richard destroys my Butcher's Cleaver and draws a card. In his second main phase, Richard casts a Keeper of Fables, letting him draw a card whenever 1 or more non-humans deals combat damage to a player. On my turn, I play an island and cast a Commander Sphere, then cast Burning Earth, doing 1 damage to a player when they tap a non-basic land for mana. Finally, I cast Ophidian Eye, enchanting Ghyrson, so whenever he deals damage to an opponent, I draw a card. This lets me tap the Catapult, doing 3 damage to Richard, drawing a card, and then I'm also able to cast a Tectonic Hazard, untapping the Catapult again and doing 3 damage to Richard and each creature he controls, letting me draw yet another card. On Richard's turn, he plays an Arid Mesa, sacrificing it, paying a life, and searching his library for a Plains, putting it into play. This triggers Felidar Retreat, letting him put 2 +1/+1 counters on each of his creatures, and this lets him attack me with his entire board, activating Kessig Wolf Run for 6, giving Keeper of Fables +6/+0 and Trample, hitting me for 24 damage, even after I block with both of my creatures, knocking me out, and winning Richard the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Now, unfortunately, we didn't wind up winning, but I do think our deck really overperformed from my expectations. I thought it might do fairly well. I thought that we might get some pings off here and there, get some extra benefits, but I mentioned to the other players in the game halfway through that I kind of felt like a jerk playing this deck because I kept bouncing their creatures and killing their creatures, and I really wasn't doing too much else to affect the board. It was just constant pressure, constant attacks in ways that they really couldn't deal with because stuff was already on the board, it was already pinging, or I had very cheap ways to do the pings, and then we had lifelink, and the deck really felt like it all synergized together. It just did exactly what I wanted it to do, and it felt incredibly powerful. So even though we didn't win, there were definitely some mistakes that I caught myself making throughout the game that I think if I had caught them at the time or before I made those mistakes, I do think we could have walked out with the victory. There were a few points where it almost felt like we were unbeatable, even though we did, of course, wind up losing. So, a very impressive performance from this deck. I was blown away by how good it felt in the game. And then, of course, let's talk about our opponents as well. So Doodle's deck, he didn't get to do quite as much as he wanted. He really struggled to get creatures in play, which didn't help when I was, wiping his board every single turn and he was getting attacked by some big creatures. So he struggled a bit with that, but he did play a very important role, doing a ton of damage with some of his charms, destroying creatures and causing people to lose lands and things like that. So very impressive showing by Ramos. Unfortunately, not super impactful, I think, beyond that. I would love to see what else Ramos can do in the future, so hopefully Doodle does bring it back. Moving on to Luke, I was a huge fan of Luke's deck. The Ruby deck that just wants to play a ton of big, beefy creatures was super, super cool, and I think it played very fun in a way that he kind of just kept dropping giant creatures every single turn, and we just had to keep dealing with them. He was really the only player at the table that was able to survive a lot of our pings with Ghyrson, because he didn't really have anything with less than 3 toughness, so he was able to keep his big boys in play and just keep applying the pressure to us, which is then why we wound up losing, because over the course of the game, I'm pretty sure Luke did more than 40 damage to us with all of his attacks. So definitely very cool and definitely a sweet build-around style of commander. And then, of course, last but not least, our winner, Richard. So a huge shout out to Richard for his nice victory. He did mention that this was the first victory he's ever gotten with Rin and Seri, so that is an awesome congratulations to him. But I think that the deck itself just showed how resilient it is, and I think the main MVP for Richard's game was probably Felidar Retreat, being able to make more tokens every single turn just by playing lands, or being able to pump up his creatures every single turn, once again just by playing lands, really helped him run away with the game in ways that I didn't expect, because making the cats is not normally a relevant thing. You see that show up a lot in landfall decks where it's just kind of a token, it just kind of exists. But being able to make a cat token and then play some Lord effects to give it +1/+1, to give it some extra abilities or extra evasion, really did a lot of work. So I was very, very impressed with Richard's deck, and it definitely matches what I said earlier when I said that that was the deck I was the most concerned about. Definitely proved to be true. So overall, let me know what you thought of the game down in the comments below. Let me know if you caught any mistakes that were made. Like I said, I know I made some in the game. I should have done some things differently. But if you catch anything, please do let me know. Otherwise, you can always like the video and subscribe to the channel, as that does help out quite a bit. But thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.